Welcome to the Insights Unlocked podcast. I'm Nathan Isaacs, Senior Manager for Content Production at User Testing. And joining us today as hosts are User Testing's Leah Hogan, Principal for Experience Research Strategy, and Mike McDowell, a Senior Solutions Consultant. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much.
And welcome, Mike.
Hey, Nathan. It's good to be back again. And hello to all the Insights Unlocked listeners out there.
And our guest today is Connor Joyce. He is a mixed methods researcher and behavioral scientist with experience at Microsoft, Twilio, Tonal, and Deloitte. He is also author of the recently published book, Bridging Intention to Impact, Transform Product Development Through Evidence-Based Decision-Making. Welcome to the show, Connor.
Thank you for having me on the Insights Unlocked podcast, everybody, and I'm excited to be here.
Great. So I'm excited to be kicking off the conversation today. And first off, I am so thrilled to be covering this topic today. And partially it's because it's something that's very top of mind for me, and I know a lot of our listeners. But just where I'd like to start is just the fact that you've had this really fascinating career journey. It started at Penn, so we're both alums, and go Quakers, had to have that in there somewhere. And I also want to share with you my congratulations on your debut book, Bridging Intention to Impact.
Thank you.
And so I think, you mentioned that some of your experiences during school very much influence your thinking around the foundation for your book. But really, what inspired you kind of along the way as you were developing the concepts around research and behavioral science and product strategy that influenced that book and your work today?
Yeah, and to start, I'll actually take it one step back a little bit further. And I started my career after I did my undergrad in psychology and HR at Deloitte, doing human capital consulting. And right at the end of my undergrad, I started to read a couple of the canonical books in behavioral science. Think like Misbehaving is probably one of the most classic ones. Nudge from Richard Thaler. There's a few others in there, and I became really interested in behavioral science as an undergrad, but had this great opportunity to join Deloitte. Did that, and while I was at Deloitte, I began to think about, well, how do I apply some of these behavioral science principles in the change management work that I'm doing? And had an opportunity to plant a couple of seeds. I saw that there was still a large change management overall structure there. So I decided, okay, I should go and really try to spin out and do some great work in the behavioral science the space with a master's. And so that was where my tech and research career really began. While in that master's, I took that knowledge of behavioral science where it's all about interventions that are going to yield behavioral change. And I realized that tech had the opportunity to take those interventions and bring them to scale. So if in consulting, it's one-off projects, if in more behavioral science research, you might be building one intervention that then you're trying to deploy to a large group of people. The best way to do that at scale is the use of technology. And so for me, I saw this natural combination of behavioral science to ultimately help people make the change that they want, and technology as being the platform to do that. And so all that happened in the master's. I became super excited. I'm going to go and I'm going to find this tech job. I'm going to help these teams build these amazing interventions, and we're going to change the world. Well, I landed soon afterwards in my first job out of college at Microsoft, and I was on a team that was doing work that really had the potential to change the way that people work. Both, it was called Workplace Analytics at the time. It's a different product now, but that team was focused on trying to create that behavioral change. Yet they still fell into the same trap that most companies to this day do. They have an ambition to go and build out a product that will create change. Yet the way they measure if that change is happening is whether or not that the team uses, or whether or not the users use that product. And so that is the fundamental assumption that I realized not just Microsoft, but the majority of tech firms make these days, is that usage alone means that a product is satisfying user outcomes. And the reality is that is not true. That is not an assumption that holds true in most cases. And so that was the work that I've been doing since then, is building processes, building frameworks, and trying to identify ways to help product teams expand their toolkit of how they define product success to ultimately satisfy user outcomes.
Actually, that's awesome. And I was trying to figure out the bridge to what I was going to ask you, and you just led me right to it, which is perfect. One of the things that I love, Connor, about the work that you're doing, the things you talk about, is the difference between output and outcomes. And it really, we talked a little bit before the show started, my history, how that really rang true, and using data to just report on the number of transactions that happen, or something like that, going, yeah, it's all great. Not really measuring whether or not there was any behavioral change. Now that we sort of talked a little bit about that, could you just elaborate a little bit more on how these behavioral insights really are integrated into the impact mindset framework that's in the book, and how that's truly transforming product development processes? You're turning it on its head.
And I'll start just quickly with the outputs versus outcomes, because I think that at first I was kind of like, am I the only one that's thinking this way? And the reality is I'm not. There are a lot of different writers. And I even heard someone from Berkshire Hathaway. I can't remember if it was Warren Buffett or Charlie. I can't remember his last name. But
Munger.
one of them has a Munger. Thank you, Charlie Munger. One of them has a great quote that was like, if you want to understand what a company is building for, look at what their incentives are. I'm not saying the quote exactly correctly, but that is, incentives drive behavior. And that's the reality. And so if you just want to start by understanding what are product managers building for, outcomes or output, a great place to start is to look at what they're being incentivized for. And again, that's the structure that is generally, that structure generally is focusing on outputs rather than outcomes. So if you look at that incentive structure and then you combine it with the fact that outcomes are generally a lot easier to measure than output. It is much easier. Most product analytic tools by default have a usage counter, have a retention counter. If you go into most of your product, we can call them product analytic, but I'm thinking of like the Pendos and the ones that you can embed surveys into the product. Most of those are NPS and basic satisfaction scores. So it makes sense that these simple outputs or simple ways of measuring how people feel about a product, rather than really, again, is it actually doing an outcome? That is the default now. And so it is what people choose as those metrics to ultimately measure. So I just want to make that comment because I think that there's a lot more voices beginning to notice this picture around that outcomes have more meaning than output, but yet the systems aren't dramatically changing yet because the incentive structure is generally still around outputs. And so that is one of the aims and why I'm using behavioral science as a bridge to ultimately start to talk about why the outcomes really do matter. And I start with the fact that people don't use products just to use them. People don't just like pick up their phone and decide, today I'm going to click on this screen because clicking on the screen makes me feel good. They click on the screen because they want entertainment. They click on the screen because they need to send messages. They click on the screen for a lot of different reasons. They're using those apps as tools to accomplish something. And that is the basis of, again, going back to what I was talking about with interventions. If people are using these apps as tools, well, then interventions are the ways to tweak that usage in a way that it makes it more effective. And so they're ultimately, as designers and product managers, overall as product teams, the aim is to think through how to create that product and create interventions specifically within it so that it's tweaking people towards satisfying the goal that they're bringing towards that product. So that is what behavioral science does best. That is the core of behavioral science, is thinking through intervention development, deployment, and then the constant iteration cycle to make that intervention better. And so that is talking about this again, starting with the outputs versus outcomes discussion, merging into how behavioral science can help leverage that change to why it is beneficial to go to the outcomes. the last piece that I'll touch on, and this is bleeding into the book a little bit, I got to plug it while I'm here. But the core of bridging intention to impact is what I call the user outcome connection. And we already touched on user outcomes are the core for why people want to use apps, why they use products. Specific behaviors are how they actually change their actions, both within the digital realm and outside of it, to actually change that outcome. But we operate within businesses. And so the last piece is that it also has to connect to a business impact. So again, the series is specific behaviors are changed by features that lead to user outcomes being impacted and ultimately a positive result for the business. And to just illustrate that really quickly, I think the fitness and finance spaces are the most easy for really talking about this because they have great measurable outcomes. If I pick up an app, I'm training right now for a half Ironman. It's my first time doing a triathlon, and I just decided, well, I'll go and jump in pretty intensely. And it has been intense, but I'm using apps to train. And so these apps, I'm looking for them to help me change my behaviors, get me to run longer, get me to get out more frequently, burn more calories, train in the right way. And if the app is succeeding at that, the outcome is being satisfied. I am getting more prepared for this half Ironman. And when there's one or two apps that I am beginning to use more frequently for that, and the end result is I'm going to retain them. I'm going to continue to pay for them because I recognize they are doing what I am asking for. So that all across the board is how I see behavioral science bringing this competitive advantage. It is that specific behavior component that connects into this larger discussion that a lot of different people are having right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. The thing that you just touched on about finance, you talked about the fitness one. As I was reading some of your work, I was thinking about check cashing, digital, check cashing with the camera. Like normally when we're just thinking about, they'd be like, all right, well, how many people cash a check with their app? But all the downstream outcomes from that, like there's less checks inside the ATM machines that are being deposited. Maybe there's less of a footprint that's needed for the bank. There's less people that are needed to staff it because you have less foot traffic. There's all these downstream outcomes that are so far beyond just that one metric of how many times do people take a picture of a check. So really, really, really great stuff. I didn't go to Penn, you guys, but you mentioned Thaler, and I listen to a lot of Freakonomics radio. So I learned to question the incentives of everything from the school of Dubner and Levitt, and they've had Thaler on a few times, having some back and forth with them. So great stuff.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because as you were speaking, the other framework that came to mind was jobs to be done. And there are two things that I think are really challenging to people inside that framework. One is that we don't really talk about anything beyond like revenue and the business outcomes of, kind of making and saving money. And the other side of that obviously focused on the user behavior side of it, which is like, what job are people hiring a particular product or service to do? But the actual like measurement of those interventions, I think, is actually the hardest part that people like encounter as they're trying to translate, even just doing like executing on the research between what are we observing in the field and interviewing people, and then what should we be taking to the design table to be able to change how people are behaving. And I would add this, in an ethical way, because you can create kind of negative feedback loops that are hurtful for people. So for example, people who exercise to extremes for weight loss purposes, right? And where we might be seeing behaviors that indicate really great engagement, it's actually really hurtful to people, right? And how do we ensure that we're preventing that kind of those types of outcomes, right? Or maybe mitigating, but then also anticipating that could be a potential thing that we could see signals of, and helping to create more positive reinforcement as well. So I guess really that leads me to the next question, which is, how do we do this in a safe, ethical, meaningful way for users and balance those needs for the business as well to achieve their business outcomes?
Yeah, I appreciate you calling out the jobs to be done. I also talk about design thinking in the book, and I say this the process that I introduce, which I call the feature impact analysis, and that's a way to validate the points in the user outcome connection. It's not intended to replace the jobs to be done, nor design thinking. It's actually a way to augment it. And it augments it because it provides a new way to think about metrics. And look, this isn't a panacea. This book is a guide. It is not, here is a list of thousands of metrics that can be used. I wish that exists. When someone builds it, then I will be very excited. But we actually do have something that gets pretty close to it. And that is ChatGPT and these other LLM systems are beginning to be able to be used, whether they are, and I should say GPT and these other LLM systems, whether they be used for within a chat interface or companies who are building on top of them. If you want to give it a quick plug, but there is all of these features that are being defined that are helping customers be able to define new features. But in the book, I talk about this dichotomy almost, and maybe that's not the right word, but it's really this 2-point process to build metrics technically. One needs to have a functional understanding of what actually needs to be done. And that's actually generally more challenging, is at least in my perspective. Whenever I've went to data scientists and engineers and I say, hey, I've got a tricky metric I'd like to build, I very rarely hear, I don't have time for that, or I don't want to do that. It's generally, ooh, a tricky problem to solve? Yeah, let's do this. But I need to have solid, defined parameters. What am I actually building? And then I go, oh, that's my job. I'm the functional guy in this situation, so I need to go and define those. And that's the tricky part. And so that's what I've written the book to be for with, that's the lens that I'm providing with it, is to equip that product team, whether it be a product manager, a researcher, a designer, to be able to say, here is how I design the metrics to be able to measure those outcomes. And that's again how it then, once you have those metrics, you can plug it into other established processes, whether it be jobs to be done to help define what are we building, whether it be design thinking to think how do we define the solution, etc. So I wanted to make that plug. I'll pause for a second if you want to respond to that. I didn't actually answer your question though, so I'm happy to actually answer your question next.
Well, how about this? How do you make sure that what you're doing is like ethical and connected with not just that short term, like are you promoting a one-off sort of behavior, but over time, a practice or a habit that is, meaningful, powerful, positive.
So when I think about the differences between really creating that short-term impact or short-term outcome and the long-term outcome, I think they're both really relevant. The short-term is what creates engagement. It's what it is, that hit of dopamine or endorphins that one gets when they complete the ring on the Apple Watch and they're able to say, today I got in my workout, or they get a little ding on their phone because they save some money on Acorns by having it round up on the dollar. Or Duolingo, I think, is filled with great examples of short-term impacts that keep people engaged in the product. The long-term outcome is that life change that they're trying to make, the habitual use that leads to something. And again, in the Apple Rings example, that'd be like, today I actually got a notification that my VO2 max is up because I've been doing so much cardio. And it was like, oh, cool, my heart's feeling healthier. That's nice. Like, that's a good outcome. That's a good long-term outcome. But it is, in my mind, you have to satisfy both. And again, when you're focusing just on outputs, it's more likely you're going to be thinking about those single short terms. Outcomes are those long-term things that are really life-changing. And in my mind, a good product will satisfy some sort of short-term outcome on every use or every couple of uses, but those will be being done and the actions being taken there will be in pursuit of a long-term outcome.
So, Connor, obviously, a lot of the through line here, we're talking about output versus outcomes. And in the article, I really hope everyone goes and reads it. I shared it on my profile on LinkedIn this morning, Build Successful Products with an Impact Mindset. You talk about sort of the build trap where people get too wrapped up focusing on the output versus the outcomes. And I think about examples of like, hey, we're going to design this new widget for the homepage, and we want people to engage with the widget and click on it. And you might have a design that focuses all eyeballs on the widget and they click on it, but doesn't actually help anything. It doesn't help any transactions, doesn't help anything. So how do we, you see, you're clearly you've encountered this before, as we all have, wondering why we ended up somewhere. What
the
are some
smirk
of the,
told it.
What's that?
I said the smirk on my face told it.
So what are some of the things that you've taken or you've been successful with trying to, help organizations use behavioral science to not fall into the build trap, as it were?
It really comes down to, again, that output versus outcomes. And if you're building to just continuously send out new growth, or if you're building to continuously pursue growth, you're going to continue to put out whatever feels right. And the feelings play a role in product development. We can call that product intuition, but it's only a part of it. And that is where it becomes really the challenge is to use product intuition enough to be able to, there is a lot to be said about understanding what a product's intended to do and what a product is being built for, but that doesn't mean that it's actually the right solution to create whatever the change is necessary to yield the outcome that is being pursued. So we've talked a lot about behavioral science. We've talked a little bit about these frameworks. The real through line of that is that the philosophy of adopting the impact mindset philosophy really comes down to beginning to start with the behaviors. And in this theory, I almost, and I speak about this to a degree in the book, but really what I have tried to do when I have been implementing this at companies is to create a body of behaviors that are believed to be in the realm of behaviorals, or in the realm of changing that outcome. Something that says, again, using the previous example of helping prepare for a triathlon, it is, what is that, all those things that might do it? It could be eating less sugary food. It could be, again, anything to do with exercise. It could be sleeping better. It could be, there's so many behaviors that are connected to that outcome. Then from there, deciding, well, what behaviors do we actually want to tackle with this product? Because, the Oura Ring does a pretty good job with sleep. So should this new product actually compete with Oura? Well, Whoop does a great job with exercise. So is it actually right for us to try to tackle those behaviors? And then you're left with, well, really, there's no good app out there that encourages someone to do 3 workouts in a day to prepare, like a bike, a run, and a swim. I'm kind of going in a wild direction here, but the whole point is just to say, with that library of behaviors, no longer are you sending out features with the hope that it's used, with the hope that usage leads to that outcome. Thinking specifically about behaviors allows one to design to change that behavior and then measure if it's working as an outcome. The thing I will add there, because I know that any product manager that's sitting here, if they're like the product managers who I've worked in the past, they will go, this sounds awesome. Thanks, Connor. I've also heard this to a degree. And my biggest problem is if I start with those behaviors, how do I know it's actually going to impact the business? I need to be able to say that when I invest my resources in this feature, it is going to provide an ROI. And if I have a single client who is breathing down my neck saying, I need this feature, I know it's at least going to satisfy them. Or if I have this intuition, or a leader who has intuition that's saying, if I build this feature, it's going to make the product better. If I go and do it, I know it's going to satisfy them. How do I know building a feature for that behavior is actually going to create an ROI? And that's where it comes back to that user outcome connection, is it's not enough just to say behavior changes outcome. One also needs to know outcome yields business impact. And if they don't know that, then that's a great place to start with really identifying, because again, it all connects back to then that is why the product exists. And if one is flying completely blind if they don't fully understand why they're building a product and what they're actually trying to achieve for that user. So I'm getting a little animated, obviously it's a fun subject for me. What I will come back to is that it comes down to those behaviors. It does require some trial and error. Plug researchers. They can always help, but anybody who is familiar, or I forgot what company has kind of coined this term, people who do research, anybody can do research. It is that trial and error of starting the behaviors list, understanding what connects into the user outcome, making sure that the company understands what that user outcome or outcomes are, and then again, ensuring that it does actually yield some sort of business impact when it is satisfied.
Excellent. Well, you'll be really happy to know that user testing is doing our part to do exactly that and help people understand the value of the business outcomes from doing all this research. And welcome back,
Love
Leah.
it. That's why I'm a fan.
Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold, so great. I'm glad to be enjoying the conversation. I just want to make sure that we definitely cover the conversation around artificial intelligence, LLM, and like the right place for it. And hopefully I haven't missed this, but I think one of the challenges that I see in this space is letting it play the right role in the work that you're doing. And so I think while we're still in the early stages of figuring out like how to make it work, what the appropriate use cases are, what are some of the things that you're starting to see around finding the right balance between efficiency, augmentation, making sure that we're still keeping people at the center of the conversation here?
Yeah, and it's a question that is ever evolving. The reality is, and that's what's fun about being in the tech space right now. It's also what's scary about being in the tech space, and there's a lot of work to be done and a lot of questions to be answered. I'll start with sharing. I personally think so. ChatGPT comes out, and it's this, and I'm not the first person to say it, but it's really, when you look at the model, it wasn't that big of a change in the model. It was more that it was a very accessible way to use LLMs, and it changed everyone's philosophy, everyone's ideas around what AI could do. Because it was a chat interface, it set the mental model that LLMs are great at content creation and content editing or tailoring. And that's true. LLMs are extraordinarily good at creating content, with all the caveats of hallucinations, of the fact that there's this whole copyright battle that is going to be resolved in 20 years, and maybe all of the LLMs will just have to like relinquish their capabilities. So there's all these caveats, but most people, when you ask them, and the research that I've done in the space has shown, the most ways that people are currently using them is around content creation and editing or tailoring. I had the chance in my last gig, I was working at a startup, and we began to use LLMs as a way to train or to teach empathy, show people another person's perspective. And it really began to open my eyes to what I think is the other main superpower of AI, and it is access to the collective knowledge of humanity. Now, big asterisks, and you all can't see, I'm throwing my hands in the air, but that is, it's been trained on, if for those that are familiar with the psychology side, weird data. It's like Western and educated, industrialized, something democratic. I can never remember the R, if anybody wants to correct me. But it's a set of data that is biased. And so when I say collective knowledge of humanity, from only what it's been trained on. But that being said, it still is. If you go in and you ask ChatGPT, here is a situation, what does it feel like to be this person? It does a pretty decent job telling you that person's perspective. Is it perfect? No. Is it biased? Yes. Can it hallucinate? Yes. But it does a really powerful job providing a perspective that will be difficult to find elsewhere unless you're combing through Reddit forums, etc. So with all of that being said, I could give you a bunch of answers to your question, but I do think that for me, and what I'm beginning to see, is that is where I am really seeing great potential with AI, is this potential to see into the lens of another. And I do that in my personal life with when I'm trying to navigate interpersonal dialogue, relationships, etc. I do it at work, again, for the same reason. I do it in my research to try to understand, putting myself in the shoes of the user to help me design how I'm going to set up a research plan. I've been doing it in as many ways as possible to really begin to understand how to better think like that person. And so I see a lot of potential there. And I have not seen as many companies building out features in that space. I feel like we're just beginning to scratch the surface on that area. But the whole reason that one would want to if we talk about it as empathy, it's all about the development of a better or higher quality output, because one is understanding who it is being delivered to and what they are trying to achieve. And so by again using AI in that capacity, circling back to your question, that actually puts the person in the center, because you're using AI to try to understand another person better, rather than using AI just to tweak some language, just to enhance a message, just to try to manipulate by using the best practice. It's instead trying to understand, why would a person think, what is a person thinking? Why would they be thinking that? And how can I craft my overall, whatever I'm working on, to be better at achieving whatever goal that I'm trying to achieve. And as I'm saying those words, I'm realizing it obviously could actually be used for manipulation. So there is an ethical piece there. As I was saying it, I'm kind of like, I guess that could, again, and you're talking to a behavioral scientist. Interventions could be called manipulation. So, you have to toe that line, and I'm not going to give you the best answer. There's much better writers on the ethics of behavioral science. But what I will say is that I've just always tried to live by the code that it is, use whatever I'm doing, whether it be AI, whether it be interventions, for the pursuit of helping someone achieve whatever goal they are trying to achieve. And if I'm operating within that boundary, I at least feel it matches my ethical code.
Yeah. And for your reference, I think R stands for rich, actually.
Oh, rich. That makes sense.
Yes.
Thank you.
But it plays in, just to respond to your point. One of the big things that we have to do is just make sure that we're representing the perspectives of everyone, so that we can get better accuracy and just understand how best to tailor those experiences in a very human-centered way. But Mike, I'll pass it over to you to continue the conversation.
Yeah, no, I just hearing names and ethics and stuff, I always think about, I'm a big fan of Robert Cialdini, and he's more behavioral psychology, maybe the behavioral science, but just the ethics of the persuasion things that he teaches. He's always like, yeah, you could use it for bad, but we try to wrap it in a nice ethical, protect yourself from these techniques with the knowledge that he can share with you. Anyways, as we're sort of rounding third here, we're really bringing it all together with sort of one of the final pieces of the insight mindset. Really thinking about all these outcomes and all this data, theoretically, that these product teams and organizations are collecting, putting it in a centralized hub so that everybody can access it. So we're not doing repeat work all the time. We see a lot of that, attempts at that, and people that need help setting those things up. What do you see as some of the struggles and some of the hurdles that companies have when trying to set a centralized hub for all this data and all this knowledge about their customers, their process, their features, what have you, getting that set up and running? What are they, and how can they overcome them?
Maintenance and buy-in. Those are the two that it comes down to. Is the maintenance piece is there's great solutions and those that are getting better. I know user testing has some. I know that there are other vendors that offer solutions and that are making it easier. But it still is that maintenance piece that makes it can be a full-time job. And the ones that I have run, I've never had an ops team that's operating on it. In my new gig, there is an ops team that's building one out, and it's being used. And just recently, a PM, I was talking to them, and they were like, "Hey, I think I found something in our Insights Hub at Microsoft that confirms what you were just talking about." And it provides. I try to avoid using the word confirm as a researcher. I think that's a good practice. So it provides evidence towards towards your what you were just saying. And I was like, oh my gosh, You went to that site and you went and you found research that supports this, and you shared it with me, and I didn't have to encourage it. You just did it, and it made me feel so good.
That's
But
great.
that honestly was the first time in my entire career that has happened.
Wow.
And so I think it's maintenance, and then I think it's buy-in in the sense that it has to be a home. And in the book, I talk about the impact mindset. Again, is the user outcome connection. It's the feature impact analysis. It is experimentation across these different layers of outcome metrics that we've discussed. But the last part is an insights hub. It has to be there has to be a home where a person can go to see features defined in the way that we discussed: behaviors, outcomes, business impact, and all the evidence that's there to support why the team believes that those features actually achieve what it's talking about. Creating that home, again, requires there's upfront work, but then it needs to be the place that people know to go to look for that. Because by nature, that begins to create a cultural change where if I go there first, hopefully you'll find the information there, and then you can avoid having to reach out to somebody. You can avoid looking through decks, etc. But B, if the information doesn't exist, well, maybe now there's an opportunity to go out to my local researcher and say, hey, I'd really like to be able to do a project here so we can create this evidence so we know that this outcome leads to that business impact. Or better yet, better to each their own, we'll say, but maybe they'll say to themselves, I'll go and do that research myself. So there is by creating that home, that the buy-in piece is just as important as keeping it maintained. And I think if people really buy into it, then by nature, there will be more maintenance. The last tip, and just being very practical about it, the biggest success that I've ever had was getting it into product team weekly meetings. I had a 5 to 10 minute review of the Insights Hub that I had created. In a sprint, it would be the kickoff of our sprint. I would get a chance to review that. That was extraordinarily impactful, and it made it that home. So people knew Connor's the researcher. Connor's main document is this Insights Hub. That is the place that I should go if I can't get a hold of Connor, or if I want to go and check something without bugging him. And so that would be is find a reoccurring meeting, find time in that reoccurring meeting. It's earning a seat at the table for research, and it's providing that resource as the home for that knowledge, for insights knowledge.
That's a really powerful statement. And I say that just because in this day when people avoid meetings as much as possible, the expensive meeting and a repository to promote that offline behavior of having a destination for people to go to is, I think, a really important thing to keep in mind. There's like a moment in time when you've got attention and you have to take advantage of it, and then you have to have a place to send people in order to ensure that there's a long-term, place for people to go. So anyway, that is a great place to put a pin in this conversation. And I say put a pin because I'm so looking forward to continuing the conversation at a future date. And I thank you so much for being on the show, and want to just, again, give you an opportunity to let people know where they can learn more about what you're up to, buy your book, or just, connect with some of your thoughts that we've discussed today.
Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity for the final plug, at least for now. So again, book is called Bridging Intention to Impact. It's published by Peach Pit. So if you want to get a copy, I ask you to go to the Peach Pit website, because I ultimately get a little bit more royalties. So always nice. I also respect most people like to buy stuff on Amazon. I do too. So if you can't go to Peach Pit for some reason, it is also on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles, where you can easily pick it up in your favorite format. As for my writing, I am on LinkedIn. Everything that I create ultimately is put on LinkedIn. I'm doing an 8-part video series where I'm going to go and discuss parts of the book over the next 8 weeks, all leading up to, I'm going to have a keynote presentation at a conference called Pandemonium. And so I'm working toward that as really trying to build some momentum as that comes together. So I will be doing that. I'm going to be doing product tank talks around a collection of cities throughout November, December. So I've got a few events that can be I will be posting about on my LinkedIn. And the last plug is I do run a consulting firm called Desired Outcome Labs. I will also have more of the dates and various pieces. You can learn more about the book, more about my speaking there. But yeah, LinkedIn's the place to go. Connect Connor is my handle. Connor Joyce again is my name. So thank you both for being, well, really all three of you all for being such great hosts. I've really enjoyed my time on the show today.
Thanks, Connor. It's such a pleasure to meet you. I already sent him the connection request. I just want to tell you that it's glad to see Microsoft is continuing to bring exceptional people in this space in. I learned a lot of what I know from ex-Microsoft people that worked on the Windows 95 rollout and went on to teach about user experience design, research, et cetera. So I actually got trained up by some folks that worked 30 years ago or so at Microsoft, but glad to see they still are bringing exceptional people on board. It was a great conversation. I look forward to staying in touch with you as well and getting into that book now that I have bought it. So such a pleasure.
I appreciate it.